Margaret Williams lived in a quiet house on Maple Street in Oakwood Estates. She was 52 years old and worked as a librarian at Pine Grove Elementary School. Every morning, she would water her small garden before going to work. Every evening, she would come home and cook dinner for two people, herself and her son David. David was 22 years old and the light of Margaret's life. He had always been a smart boy who loved computers and video games. When he was little, he would sit next to Margaret while she read books, asking her questions about every story. As he grew up, he became the one helping her with technology problems and teaching her how to use her smartphone. 3 years ago, everything changed. David started feeling tired all the time. He would sleep for 12 hours and still feel exhausted. At first, Margaret thought it was just stress from college. David was studying computer science and working part-time at a local electronics store. Maybe he was pushing himself too hard. But then David started losing weight. His clothes became loose and his face looked thin. Margaret made him go to the doctor, even though David said he was fine. The doctor ran some tests and told them to come back in a week. That week felt like the longest week of Margaret's life. When they returned to the doctor's office, Margaret knew something was wrong by the look on the doctor's face. He sat them down and said the words that changed everything. David has leukemia. Margaret felt like the world stopped spinning. She heard the doctor talking about treatment options and hospital stays, but everything sounded far away and fuzzy. David took the news better than his mother did. He asked practical questions about treatment and how long it would take. He wanted to know if he could finish college and keep working. Margaret just sat there trying not to cry in front of her brave son. The next 3 years became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and sleepless nights. Margaret learned words she never wanted to know, like white blood cell count and bone marrow biopsy. She took time off work whenever David had treatments. She drove him to appointments, sat with him during chemo, and held his hand when he felt sick. David was determined to live a normal life despite his illness. He continued going to college even when he was weak from treatment. His professors were understanding and let him take classes online when he couldn't come to campus. His friends from school would visit him at home, bringing homework and funny stories to cheer him up. Margaret watched her son fight his disease with courage she didn't know he had. On good days, David would joke about losing his hair and say he looked like a movie star. On bad days, when the chemo made him sick, he would still try to smile for his mother's sake. Margaret knew David was being strong for her, just like she was trying to be strong for him. The neighbors in Oakwood Estates were mostly kind and supportive. Mrs. Chen from next door would bring homemade soup when David was having a rough week. Mr. Rodriguez across the street would mow their lawn without being asked. The young couple with twins would leave grocery bags on their doorstep with a note saying, "Thinking of you." Margaret was grateful for the help, but she was also too proud to ask for more. She wanted to take care of David herself. She felt like being a good mother meant doing everything alone. She would stay up all night when David couldn't sleep, and she would research new treatments on the internet for hours. During David's second year of treatment, he met a girl named Sarah at the hospital. Sarah was also getting treatment for cancer, and she and David became close friends. They would text each other jokes and support each other through the hard days. Margaret was happy that David had found someone who understood what he was going through. David graduated from college a year late, but he graduated. Margaret cried happy tears at the ceremony as she watched her son walk across the stage to get his diploma. David looked thin and tired, but he was smiling the biggest smile Margaret had ever seen. That day, she thought maybe everything would be okay. But in the spring of David's third year with leukemia, things started getting worse. The treatments weren't working as well as they used to. David started spending more time in bed and less time on his computer. He stopped joking as much and started sleeping more. Margaret could see the worry in his eyes, even though he tried to hide it. Margaret took extended leave from the library to take care of David full-time. She moved his bed to the living room so he could look out the window at her garden. She set up all his favorite things around him, his gaming setup, his book collection, and photos of all their good memories together. David's friends came to visit more often. Sarah would sit with him and watch movies. His college friends would bring their laptops and work on projects together. Even though David was too weak to help much, Margaret would make sandwiches and drinks for everyone, happy to see David surrounded by people who loved him. As the weeks passed, David became weaker. He needed help getting to the bathroom and eating meals. Margaret helped him with everything, never complaining or showing how scared she was. At night, she would sit next to his bed and read him stories, just like when he was little. One quiet Tuesday morning in May, David took Margaret's hand and told her he loved her. He said she was the best mother in the world and that he was proud to be her son. He closed his eyes and went to sleep peacefully, never waking up again. Margaret held his hand and whispered all the things she wanted him to know, how proud she was of him, how brave he had been, and how much she would miss him. The next few days passed in a fog. Margaret called the funeral home and David's friends. She picked out his favorite suit and chose flowers for the service. She decided to have the funeral reception in their backyard, because David had always loved sitting in the garden during his good days. Margaret spent the week before the funeral, cleaning the house and preparing everything. She wanted David's memorial service to be perfect. She arranged for his favorite foods to be served and made photo displays showing his whole life. Neighbors offered to help, but Margaret insisted on doing everything herself. This was her final gift to her beloved son, and she wanted it to be just right. The morning of the funeral, Margaret woke up early and got dressed in her best black dress. She pinned David's favorite tie pin to her collar, a small silver compass he had given her for Mother's Day when he was 16. She looked at herself in the mirror and promised David that she would make him proud today. The morning of David's funeral was beautiful. The sun was shining and there was a gentle breeze in the air. Margaret looked out her bedroom window and thought David would have loved this kind of day. He always said sunny days made everything feel better, even during his worst times in the hospital. Margaret got ready slowly, taking her time with everything. She wanted to look perfect for David's service. She put on her black dress and David's compass pin. She looked at herself in the mirror and took a deep breath. Today would be hard, but she would get through it for David. The funeral service at Wilson Funeral Home was exactly what Margaret had hoped for. About 60 people came to say goodbye to David. His college friends sat in the front rows, some of them crying quietly. Sarah, the girl David had met at the hospital, sat with Margaret and held her hand during the hardest parts. People shared beautiful stories about David. His computer science professor talked about how smart David was and how he never gave up, even when he was sick. His friends from the electronics store told funny stories about David helping customers and making everyone laugh. His childhood friend Tommy talked about all the video games they played together and how David always let him win. Margaret felt surrounded by love. She had been so focused on taking care of David for 3 years that she had forgotten how many people cared about them. Seeing all these people who loved David made her heart feel a little less broken. After the service, everyone drove to Margaret's house for the reception. Margaret had worked for days to make everything perfect. She had set up tables and chairs in the backyard under the big oak tree where David used to sit and read. She had ordered all of David's favorite foods: pizza, chocolate cake, and those little sandwiches he loved from the deli downtown. The backyard looked beautiful. Margaret had hung white lights in the trees and put flowers everywhere. She had made photo boards showing David's life from when he was a baby all the way through college graduation. People walked around looking at the pictures and sharing more stories about David. Margaret felt peaceful for the first time in weeks. Everyone was being so kind and supportive. David's friends were helping serve food and making sure all the older guests had places to sit. The neighbors had brought extra chairs and were quietly helping with everything. This was exactly what David would have wanted, all his favorite people together sharing good memories. Mrs. Chen came over and hugged Margaret. "David was such a good boy," she said with tears in her eyes. "He always helped me carry my groceries when he was feeling..." "Well enough, you raised a wonderful son." Mr. Rodriguez shook Margaret's hand and said, "If you need anything at all, just ask. David was like family to all of us in the neighborhood. We're here for you." Margaret felt grateful for these kind people. She had been so worried about getting through this day, but everyone was making it easier. People were eating David's favorite foods, looking at his pictures, and talking about all the good times. It felt like a celebration of David's life instead of just sadness about his death. Sarah came over and sat next to Margaret on the porch steps. "Thank you for letting me be here," Sarah said quietly. "David talked about you all the time. He was so proud of you and how strong you were during his treatment." "He was proud of you too," Margaret replied. "You made his last year so much better. Having a friend who understood what he was going through meant everything to him." About an hour into the reception, Margaret was starting to relax. The worst part was over, and now she could just enjoy being surrounded by people who loved David. She was talking to David's college friends about his favorite class when something unexpected happened. The front door of the house burst open with a loud bang. Everyone in the backyard turned to look as someone marched through the house and out the back door. It was Linda Peterson from down the street. Margaret knew Linda by sight but had never really talked to her much. Linda was always complaining about something in the neighborhood, but Margaret had been too busy with David's care to pay attention to neighborhood drama. Linda was a woman in her 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive clothes. She always looked like she was dressed for a business meeting, even when she was just walking her little dog around the block. Margaret had noticed that other neighbors seemed to avoid Linda, but she had never understood why. Now Linda was standing in Margaret's backyard, holding a clipboard and looking angry. The peaceful atmosphere of the reception suddenly felt tense. Everyone stopped talking and stared at this woman who had just barged into their gathering. Linda looked around the backyard with disapproving eyes. She started counting the cars parked on the street and writing things down on her clipboard. She pulled out a measuring tape and began measuring the distance between the tables and the property line. "Excuse me," Margaret said, walking over to Linda. "Can I help you with something?" Linda didn't even look at Margaret. She kept writing on her clipboard and measuring things. "I'm conducting an inspection of this property," Linda announced loudly. "There are multiple violations of neighborhood standards happening here." Margaret was confused. "I'm sorry, what violations? This is a private gathering on my own property." "First of all," Linda said, still not looking at Margaret, "you have too many cars parked on the street. The neighborhood rules clearly state that residents cannot have more than 4 visitors' cars at one time." Margaret looked around. There were maybe 10 cars parked along the street, which seemed perfectly normal for a gathering. "I wasn't aware of any such rule," Margaret said politely. "Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse," Linda snapped. She pointed at the tables in the backyard. "And these temporary structures were not approved by the neighborhood committee. Any outdoor furniture arrangements that change the appearance of the property must be submitted for approval at least 2 weeks in advance." The guests were all watching this strange scene unfold. David's friends looked confused and angry. The neighbors looked embarrassed that someone from their street was acting this way. Margaret felt like she was in some kind of bad dream. "Linda," said Mrs. Chen, stepping forward, "this is David's funeral reception. Margaret just buried her son today. Maybe this isn't the right time for this kind of thing." Linda finally looked up from her clipboard. "I don't care what the occasion is," she said coldly. "Rules are rules, and they apply to everyone equally. Personal situations don't give anyone the right to violate neighborhood standards." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This woman had just crashed her son's funeral reception and was treating it like some kind of code violation. Margaret stood frozen in her backyard, staring at Linda Peterson in complete shock. She could not believe that someone would crash her son's funeral reception and start talking about neighborhood rules. The 40 people gathered to remember David were all watching this bizarre scene unfold. Linda seemed to enjoy having everyone's attention. She held up her clipboard like it was some kind of official document and started walking around the backyard, pointing at different things and writing notes. "Let me see," Linda said in a loud voice. "Violation number 1. Excessive street parking without proper permits. Violation number 2. Unauthorized outdoor furniture arrangement. Violation number 3. She stopped and pointed at the beautiful flower arrangements Margaret had placed around the garden. "Temporary landscaping modifications without committee approval." David's friend Tommy stepped forward, his face red with anger. Lady, what is wrong with you? This is a funeral. Show some respect. Linda looked at Tommy like he was a bug she wanted to step on. Young man, I don't know who you are, but this is a neighborhood matter. These violations affect property values for everyone who lives here. Sarah, David's friend from the hospital, moved closer to Margaret and put her arm around her. Margaret was shaking, not from fear but from pure shock. In all her 52 years, she had never met anyone so cold and heartless. Linda, said Mr. Rodriguez, stepping forward with his hands raised peacefully. Please. Margaret just buried her son today. Can't this wait until tomorrow? No, it cannot wait, Linda snapped. I've been watching this property for weeks and the violations just keep getting worse. Today is the final straw. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of everything. The tables, the chairs, the flowers, even the guests themselves. Margaret found her voice at last. Linda, please, she said quietly. I'm asking you as nicely as I can. This is my son's funeral reception. These people are here to remember David and support me during the hardest day of my life. Please, can you just leave us alone? Linda stopped taking pictures and looked directly at Margaret for the first time. What she said next would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. I don't care if it's your son's funeral, your daughter's wedding, or your grandmother's birthday party, Linda said with ice in her voice. You live in this neighborhood and you follow the same rules as everyone else. Your personal problems are not my concern. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Margaret felt like Linda had slapped her across the face. Several of David's friends started moving toward Linda, but Margaret held up her hand to stop them. You don't understand, Margaret said, her voice starting to shake. David was sick for 3 years. He fought cancer with more courage than most adults could ever manage. He was only 22 years old when he died. This reception is not about violating rules. It's about honoring the memory of my child. Linda's response was even worse than her first one. Everyone has sob stories, she said coldly. Everyone thinks their situation is special. But if we let people break the rules every time something bad happens, then we have no rules at all. Property values would collapse and the whole neighborhood would fall apart. Mrs. Chen gasped out loud. Several other neighbors shook their heads in disgust. Even Linda's own next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Mr. Foster, looked embarrassed by her behavior. Furthermore, Linda continued, warming up to her subject, you should have planned better. If you knew you were going to have a large gathering, you should have rented a community center or a restaurant. Residential properties are not meant for events like this. Margaret felt tears starting to flow down her cheeks. She had spent weeks planning this reception, wanting everything to be perfect for David. She had chosen to have it at home because David loved their backyard. He used to sit under the oak tree during his good days, reading books and watching the birds. Having his memorial here felt like keeping him close to home one last time. David loved this backyard, Margaret whispered. He spent so many peaceful hours here during his treatment. I wanted his friends to see the place that brought him comfort. That's very touching, Linda said sarcastically. But it doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of multiple neighborhood standards. I've documented everything, and I'll be filing a formal complaint with the city first thing Monday morning. David's college professor, a kind older man named Dr. Martinez, stepped forward. Ma'am, I don't know what kind of person you are, but what you're doing here today is simply wrong. This woman just lost her only child. Have you no shame at all? Linda turned on Dr. Martinez with fury. Don't you dare lecture me about what's right and wrong. I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years and I've watched it slowly decline because people like her think the rules don't apply to them. Well, I'm here to make sure everyone follows the same standards. What rules? Shouted Tommy, no longer able to contain his anger. Who made you the boss of this neighborhood? Where's your badge? Where's your official paperwork? Linda held up her clipboard triumphantly. I am the elected representative of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association Standards Committee. I have the authority to investigate violations and issue citations. Mr. Rodriguez frowned. Linda, we don't have a homeowners association. This neighborhood was never set up with an HOA. We have an informal association, Linda replied quickly, and I was elected by the concerned residents to maintain property. Standards. Who elected you? Asked Mrs. Chen. I've lived here for 15 years and nobody ever asked me to vote for anything. Linda's face was getting red, but she wasn't backing down. The election was properly conducted according to standard procedures. Just because you weren't paying attention doesn't mean it didn't happen. Margaret realized that Linda was making everything up as she went along. There was no homeowners association. There were no official rules. Linda was just a bully who enjoyed pushing people around and making them miserable. But even knowing this, Margaret felt powerless to stop her. This was supposed to be David's day, a time for celebrating his life and sharing good memories. Instead, it had turned into a nightmare because of one cruel woman who seemed to enjoy causing pain. Please, Margaret said one last time, just let us finish remembering my son in peace. Linda's final words were the cruelest of all. Your son is dead, she said flatly. This party won't bring him back. But my property values are very much alive, and I intend to protect them. After Linda's final cruel words about David being dead, the entire backyard fell silent. Margaret felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. The guests looked horrified. Even Linda seemed to realize she had gone too far, but instead of apologizing, she just lifted her chin higher and walked back toward the house. I'll be filing my report on Monday, Linda announced as she marched through the backyard. You have until then to remove all these violations, and next time think twice before disrupting our peaceful neighborhood. With that, she stomped through the house and slammed the front door behind her. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. Margaret stood frozen in place, tears streaming down her face. Sarah was still holding her arm, and Mrs. Chen had her hand over her mouth in shock. David's friends looked like they wanted to chase after Linda and give her a piece of their minds. Dr. Martinez was the first to speak. Margaret, I'm so sorry. In 40 years of teaching, I have never seen such cruelty and heartlessness. Please don't let that woman's poison ruin David's beautiful memorial. Tommy was pacing back and forth, his hands clenched into fists. Who does she think she is? We should call the police. She can't just barge into someone's house and terrorize them like that. Tommy's right, said Sarah angrily. That woman is sick in the head. Nobody normal acts like that at a funeral. We should do something. Margaret slowly shook her head. No, she said quietly. I don't want David's day to be about anger and fighting. Let's just try to remember him with love. But even as Margaret said these words, something was changing inside her. For 3 years, she had focused all her energy on taking care of David and being strong for him. She had avoided conflict and tried to stay positive through the worst times of their lives. She had always been the quiet librarian who kept to herself and didn't make waves. Now, for the first time since David's diagnosis, Margaret felt something besides sadness and exhaustion. Deep in her chest, a small flame of anger was beginning to grow. Linda Peterson had not just disrespected her and her guests, she had dishonored David's memory on the one day that was supposed to be sacred. The reception continued, but the peaceful mood was broken. People tried to go back to sharing stories about David, but everyone was still upset about Linda's behavior. Several neighbors apologized to Margaret, saying they were embarrassed that someone from their street had acted so terribly. I've lived next to Linda for 3 years, said Mr. Foster quietly. She's always complaining about something, but I never imagined she could be this cruel. I'm truly sorry, Margaret. Mrs. Chen patted Margaret's hand. Don't let that bitter woman poison your heart, dear. She's not worth it. Focus on all the love surrounding you today. Margaret nodded and tried to smile, but inside, the flame of anger was growing stronger. She kept thinking about Linda's words. Your son is dead. This party won't bring him back. How could anyone be so heartless? How could anyone look at a grieving mother and say such terrible things? As the afternoon went on, people began to leave. Everyone hugged Margaret and told her to call if she needed anything. David's friends promised to stay in touch and visit often. Sarah gave Margaret her phone number and made her promise to call whenever she felt lonely. By evening, Margaret was alone in her house. The backyard was empty except for a few paper plates blowing in the wind. The photo boards of David still stood under the oak tree, and the flowers were already starting to wilt in the warm air. Margaret sat on her couch and looked around at the quiet house. Just that morning it had been filled with love and memories of David. Now it felt empty and sad. But underneath the sadness, that flame of anger was still burning, and it was getting stronger by the hour. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret was thinking about something other than David's care or her own grief. She was thinking about Linda Peterson and her fake authority. She was thinking about how Linda had terrorized not just her, but probably other neighbors too. She was thinking about how someone needed to stop Linda from hurting more people. Margaret had never been a fighter. She had always believed in being kind and avoiding conflict. When David was little and other kids were mean to him, she taught him to walk away and tell a teacher. When difficult parents came to the library and yelled about overdue book fees, she stayed calm and polite. When David was sick and some of the hospital staff were rude, she bit her tongue and focused on getting David the care he needed. But this was different. Linda had crossed a line that should never be crossed. She had attacked a grieving mother at her child's funeral. She had dishonored David's memory with her cruelty and selfishness. And Margaret realized that staying quiet and being polite wasn't going to stop Linda from hurting other people. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Linda's words over and over in her mind. "Your son is dead. This party won't bring him back." The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. David had been the kindest, bravest person Margaret had ever known. He had faced cancer with courage and grace. He had never complained, even on his worst days. He had always tried to make other people feel better, even when he was the one who was suffering. David deserved better than to have his memory tainted by Linda's poison. He deserved to be remembered with love and respect, not cruelty and fake violations. Margaret got out of bed and walked to her computer. She had never been good with technology, but David had taught her the basics before he got too sick. She turned on the computer and started searching the internet for information about homeowners associations and neighborhood regulations. What she found made her even angrier. She discovered that Linda had been lying about everything. There was no Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. There were no official neighborhood rules. There was no standards committee. Linda had made it all up to give herself power over other people. Margaret spent the rest of the night reading about property, rights and harassment laws. She learned about what constituted legal authority and what didn't. She read about other people who had dealt with neighborhood bullies like Linda, and slowly a plan began to form in her mind. For 3 years, Margaret had been focused on David's needs. She had put her own feelings aside to be strong for him. She had avoided anything that might create stress or conflict. But David was gone now, and Margaret was discovering that she had feelings she didn't even know existed. She was angry. She was determined. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to fight back. Margaret woke up Monday morning with a clear purpose for the first time in months. She had spent the weekend researching and planning, and now she was ready to take action. The quiet librarian who had always avoided conflict was gone. In her place was a determined woman who would not let Linda Peterson hurt anyone else. Margaret's first stop was Mrs. Chen's house next door. When Mrs. Chen opened the door, she immediately looked worried. "Oh, Margaret dear, how are you holding up? After that terrible woman's behavior?" "Actually, that's what I want to talk to you about," Margaret said. "Can I come in? I need to ask you some questions about Linda." Mrs. Chen made tea while Margaret explained her plan. "I've been thinking about what happened at David's reception, and I realize that Linda has probably been bullying other people in the neighborhood too. I want to find out who else she's harassed." Mrs. Chen's eyes lit up. "Oh my, yes, that woman has been a nightmare for years. She came to my house last fall and told me my garden gnomes were inappropriate lawn decorations that violated some made-up rule. She made my poor husband move them 3 times before she was satisfied." Margaret took notes as Mrs. Chen told her story. Then she visited Mr. Rodriguez across the street. He had an even worse story. Linda had measured his driveway and claimed his car was parked 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. She had threatened to have his car towed and demanded he pay a $50 fine to her fake homeowners association. "I actually paid her the $50. Mr. Rodriguez admitted, looking embarrassed. My English isn't perfect, and she had all these official-looking papers. I thought maybe I really was breaking some rule I didn't understand. Margaret felt her anger growing stronger. Linda had been stealing money from her neighbors by pretending to have authority she didn't possess. This was fraud, plain and simple. House by house, Margaret gathered stories. The young couple with twins had been told their children's swing set was too close to the property line. The elderly man at the end of the street had been forced to repaint his mailbox 3 times because Linda claimed the color was not within approved guidelines. The widow 2 doors down had been terrorized about her bird feeders attracting unauthorized wildlife. By the end of the week, Margaret had documented 15 different households that Linda had harassed. Many people had stories going back several years. Some had paid Linda's fake fines. Others had made expensive changes to their property to satisfy her made-up rules. Everyone was afraid of her because she acted so official and threatening. Margaret's next step was to contact a lawyer. She found a legal aid office that helped people with neighborhood disputes. When she told the lawyer about Linda's activities, the woman's eyes grew wide with shock. Mrs. Williams, what you're describing is multiple criminal offenses, the lawyer said. Impersonating an official representative, fraud, extortion, harassment. This woman could face serious charges. The fact that she did this at your son's funeral makes it even worse. The lawyer agreed to help Margaret for free after hearing about the funeral incident. Together, they prepared a formal complaint to file with the police and the city attorney's office. They also drafted letters to all the neighbors who had been victimized, explaining Linda's illegal activities and offering to help them get their money back. But Margaret wasn't finished yet. She had one more surprise planned for Linda Peterson. Margaret organized a neighborhood meeting for the following Saturday. She invited everyone Linda had ever harassed, plus all the other residents of Oakwood Estates. She didn't tell anyone what the meeting was about, just that it concerned important neighborhood matters. Saturday afternoon, Margaret set up chairs in the community park at the end of their street. About 30 neighbors showed up, curious about what was going on. Margaret had prepared carefully for this moment. Just as the meeting was starting, Linda Peterson appeared. She had obviously heard about the gathering and assumed it was related to her fake homeowners association. She marched over carrying her usual clipboard and measuring tape. I wasn't informed about this meeting, Linda announced loudly. All neighborhood gatherings must be approved by the Standards Committee. Margaret stood up and faced Linda directly. You're absolutely right, Linda. This meeting is about neighborhood standards. Why don't you have a seat? I think you'll find this very interesting. Linda looked suspicious but sat down in the front row, clearly expecting to be in charge of whatever was happening. Margaret began by thanking everyone for coming. Then she said, I've called this meeting because we have a serious problem in our neighborhood. For years, one person has been terrorizing residents with fake rules, illegal fines, and fraudulent authority. Today, we're going to put a stop to it. Linda's face went pale as Margaret continued. 2 weeks ago, at my son David's funeral reception, Linda Peterson crashed our gathering and threatened me with fake violations. But that was just the latest in a long pattern of harassment and illegal activity. One by one, Margaret called on neighbors to share their stories. Mrs. Chen talked about the garden gnome incident. Mr. Rodriguez explained how he had been tricked into paying $50 for a fake violation. The young couple described how Linda had terrorized them about their children's playground equipment. With each story, Linda seemed to shrink smaller in her chair. Her face went from pale to red to pale again. She tried to interrupt several times, but the neighbors shouted her down. Years of pent-up anger were finally being released. When the testimonies were finished, Margaret delivered the final blow. I've been working with a lawyer in the police department to document Linda's criminal activities. We've filed formal complaints for fraud, extortion, and impersonating a government official. The city attorney's office will be pressing charges. Linda jumped to her feet, her face bright red with fury. You can't do this to me. I'm the elected representative of the Homeowners Association. I have authority here. Margaret smiled calmly. Linda, we all know there is no homeowners association. There never was. You made it all up to bully people and steal their money. But that ends today. The lawyer Margaret had been working with stepped forward from the crowd. Ms. Peterson, I'm here to serve you with these legal documents. You're being sued by multiple residents for fraud and harassment. You're also facing criminal charges. Linda's whole fake empire collapsed in that moment. The neighbors formed a real neighborhood watch group with elected representatives and proper procedures. They banned Linda from their properties and warned her that any future harassment would result in immediate arrest. Within a month, Linda Peterson had moved out of Oakwood Estates. The neighborhood became peaceful again, and Margaret had earned the respect and gratitude of everyone around her. Margaret had found her strength in the darkest moment of her life. She had honored David's memory by standing up to a bully and protecting other innocent people. The quiet librarian had become a neighborhood hero, and David would have been so proud of his brave mother.